Ever get that feeling? You shake on a deal, everything seems cool, but then later you find out there was some like unspoken details, you
Oh,
know?
totally. Like that, like new foam that's actually more like repaired new. Classic.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. Duty of good faith in contracts. It's basically the law's way of saying, hey, even if you didn't write it down, you got to play fair.
It's about preventing those gotcha moments, even when every little thing isn't spelled out in a contract.
So we're going beyond just the words on paper then. There's this unspoken obligation to be honest in how you handle agreements.
Exactly. And our sources are very clear on this. This duty is woven into every single contract out there. Big or small, doesn't matter.
Right.
Restatement 205, UCC, Section 1304, it's the law.
Okay, that's reassuring to hear. But good faith, I don't know, it's a little vague, right? How can something so, I don't know, interpretive actually hold up in court? How do they even define it?
That's the tricky part. It's a bit like nailing jelly to a wall, honestly. But one way to think about it is the excluder definition. Summers came up with that one. Basically, instead of saying what good faith is, you focus on what it isn't.
Interesting. So kind of defining it in reverse.
Yeah. Sneaky tactics, hiding important information. Think of it like if you were playing poker and trying to get away with an extra ace up your sleeve. Anything that's like, I'm trying to pull a fast one, that's the opposite of good faith.
So if I traded you my, let's say, amazing apple pie for your prized comic book collection, but forgot to mention the pie was missing a few slices.
Exactly. That's our cue to call the legal police. Then you've got Burton's definition, which gets more at the heart of fairness in bargaining. Let's say we agreed you get the bigger slice of cake. Sounds fair, right? But then I try to swoop in and claim half your frosting, too.
Not cool. So it's about honoring the agreement, the intention behind it, not just the literal words.
Absolutely. And the UCC, it really gets at the heart of it with its definition of good faith. They define it as, get this, honesty in fact and observing commercially reasonable standards of fair dealing.
Okay, so break that down. It means you have to be honest in your own mind, like you said, but also in how you're acting objectively within the whole context of the deal.
You got it. Two sides of the same coin.
So there's a difference between making a genuine mistake, like, I don't know, accidentally putting the wrong date on something, versus having a pattern of being deliberately deceptive.
Big time. We all make mistakes, right?
Yeah.
But if someone's got a reputation for always trying to weasel their way out of agreements, that's different. And that actually brings us to another key point, the duty of cooperation. You can't actively get in the way of the other party holding up their end of the bargain.
So if I agree to, say, deliver a presentation, I can't just show up with a slideshow of, like, cat pictures and say, hey, I fulfilled my obligation.
You got it. And this was actually a major factor in a landmark case, Patterson v. Meyerhofer, back in 1912. It involved a woman who agreed to buy land at auction, but the catch was she was specifically buying it for someone else.
Okay.
Well, she ends up bidding against him, driving up the price.
No way. That's, like, next level shady.
The court thought so too. She got slapped with violating the duty of good faith because she directly messed with his ability to fulfill his side of the deal.
That's wild. But let's be real. Doesn't that kind of thing happen all the time? People trying to bend the rules, find loopholes without technically breaking the contract.
Absolutely. But there's where the law tries to provide some protection. There's this thing called the safe harbor rule. Basically, as long as you're sticking to what the contract clearly lays out, you're usually safe from those bad faith accusations.
So, like, if we had a contract that says, I'll walk your dog on Tuesdays for, I don't know, 20 bucks, and you decide you want me to mow your lawn for that price too, I'm in the clear to say, nope, not part of the deal.
Precisely. And a great example of this is Centronics Core v. Genicum. Centronics wanted early payment from an escrow account, but the contract specifically said those funds were only released after arbitration. They tried to argue, but the court was like, nope. Genicum was just following the rules.
Sticking to the agreed upon terms is good faith.
Makes sense. But contracts aren't always set in stone, are they? What about modifications? Can you even make changes to a contract in good faith?
Ah, good question. That's where things get even more interesting because the UCC and common law actually have different approaches when it comes to modifications. Under the UCC, you can modify a contract without needing new consideration, as long as it's done in good faith, of course.
Hold on. Back up, by consideration, you mean like something of value being exchanged.
Exactly. Like, I give you something, you give me something, and we're both happy. But the UCC is a bit more flexible on that front, as long as everyone's acting in good faith.
So it's a bit more relaxed about changes to the deal as long as nobody's trying to pull a fast one. You got it. But that good faith element, that's key. And to see how important that really is, we've got a case for you. Roth Steel Products, v. Sharon Steel Corp. This one shows how those modifications can go wrong.
Okay, so Roth Steel, refresh our memory. What went down there?
All right, picture this. Sharon Steel, they're the seller in this case, they jack up their prices out of the blue, hit Roth Steel with this sudden increase. Their reasoning.
No.
Market fluctuations.
Okay, sure. Happens all the time. Supply and demand, right?
Right. Sounds legit on the surface, right? Except, here's the kicker. Sharon Steel. They're still selling to their own subsidiary company, and get this, at the lower price.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So the court saw right through that, ruled that Sharon Steel, they weren't acting in good faith. They were misrepresenting the whole situation, using their position to basically strong-arm Roth Steel.
So even if you've got what sounds like a good excuse, if you're being shady behind the scenes, the court can still call you out.
You got it. And this emphasis on honesty, super important when we're talking about output contracts. Imagine a scenario, right? A farmer agrees to sell their whole apple harvest, every last apple, to one specific cider mill.
Okay, so the cider mill is their only buyer.
Exactly. That's an output contract. Seller's got to provide everything. Buyer's obligated to take it all.
Sounds kind of risky for both sides. What if the harvest is terrible or, I don't know, the cider mill has a bad year and doesn't need as many apples?
And that's where the UCC gets really specific about good faith. The seller, our apple farmer in this case, they have to keep producing, keep supplying those apples in good faith. Unless, of course, something major happens like, I don't know, a blight wipes out their orchard and they're facing huge losses. It can't just be, oh, well, someone down the road offered me a better price.
So no sudden career changes for our apple farmer, like no deciding to become a banjo player instead.
Not if they want to avoid a breach of contract lawsuit, that's for sure. And there's actually a classic case that illustrates this perfectly. Feld v. Henry Levy and Sons. We're talking breadcrumbs here. The company, they had this output contract, agreed to supply breadcrumbs, and then bam, stopped making them.
Just like that.
Pretty much. Claimed it wasn't profitable anymore. But the buyer took them to court, and the court actually sided with the buyer. Said they hadn't proven those losses were significant enough to just break the agreement.
Wow. So even if you wake up one morning and decide you can't stand the sight of another breadcrumb, you might be stuck with that contract. That's intense. Which I guess brings us to another UCC concept. You mentioned the perfect tender rule. And honestly, it sounds a little intimidating.
It's not as scary as it sounds. Perfect tender just means what you deliver has to match what's in the contract exactly. Think of it like, I don't know, ordering a pizza, right? You expect to get what you ordered. Pepperoni, mushrooms, hold the anchovies.
What if they get my order wrong?
Well, the seller, they get a chance to fix it, but it's got to be within a reasonable time frame. If they can't, then yeah, as the buyer, you have the right to reject the whole thing.
So if I very clearly say no anchovies, and those anchovies show up, they better be sending a new pizza ASAP.
Precisely. And this actually played out in the case of Austrian Airlines VUT Finance Corp. Now, we're talking about used airplanes here, so a tad higher stakes than a pizza.
Just a bit.
The contract allowed UT Finance to reject any planes that didn't meet the agreed-upon specs. And, well, they found some issues, parts not assembled right, a decline in the plane's value, they weren't messing around, rejected the delivery.
I can't imagine the paperwork involved in rejecting an airplane delivery.
Right. But the seller, they cried, bad faith. But the court sided with UT Finance. They were just sticking to the contract, plain and simple.
So having that clear contract language is key, but what about when we're talking about services, not goods? Does this duty of good faith idea apply to employment contracts?
And that, my friend, is where things get even more interesting. With employment contracts, there isn't one clear-cut, universal approach to this whole duty of good faith business.
Yeah.
Different states, different interpretations. It's a whole other can of worms.
So it's not as straightforward as saying good faith applies to all contracts, end of story. There's some wiggle room.
Especially when it comes to employment. Generally speaking, you've got two main approaches. The majority approach, and then, as you might guess, the minority approach.
Okay, break it down. What's the difference?
So the majority approach, it tends to be more employee-friendly. Basically, it says, look, even if the employment contract doesn't explicitly state duty of good faith, it's implied, just like with those contracts for goods we were talking about.
So employers can't just be shady or unfair just because the contract doesn't spell it out word for word.
Exactly. Now, the minority approach, it's less common for a reason. Not as many states follow it, and it's definitely not as much in the employee's favor.
Interesting. Why wouldn't good faith be implied in an employment contract? Seems like a no-brainer.
Well, the argument is that employment, it's different from like a one-time transaction. It's an ongoing relationship, right?
Mm.
The minority approach, it worries that this strict duty of good faith, it could become too burdensome for employers, limit their ability to manage their workforce effectively.
So it's kind of a balancing act, trying to protect employees, but also giving employers some flexibility.
Exactly. And that's why this whole area gets really complicated really fast. The outcome often hinges on the specific details of the case and the laws of that state.
Sounds like a good reason to have an employment lawyer on speed dial, just in case. But to help us really get the difference between these two approaches, can you give us a hypothetical case? How might things play out differently under each approach?
Absolutely. Let's say we got an employee, we'll call him John, been with the company for years. He's got one of those at-will contracts, meaning the employer can let him go at any time for any legal reason, no specific cause needed.
Right, I've heard of those. Don't seem very secure for the employee.
They give employers a lot of leeway. Now, let's say John gets fired out of the blue. Seems totally random, and he suspects it's because his boss just doesn't like him.
Even if that's technically allowed under the contract, it doesn't seem very fair.
Exactly. So under that majority approach, John might actually have a case. He could argue that getting fired like that, it's a breach of that implied duty of good faith. Even though the contract said they could fire him without cause, the employer still has an obligation to act honestly, fairly.
So even with those at-will contracts, you can't just fire someone because you woke up in a bad mood.
It's definitely more nuanced than that. They'd need some kind of justification, something more concrete than just, well, I don't like the way John parts his hair. Now flip that and look at the minority approach. We've got a perfect case here, Hillis Land v. Federal Land Bank. This CEO, also at will, gets fired because of a conflict of interest.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right, so he claims bad faith. But remember, his contract allowed for termination without a specific cause, right? So the court, following that minority approach, they said, sorry, no implied duty of good faith here.
He was out of luck.
Tough break. Which is why it's so important to understand these different approaches and know what the law is in your specific state when you're dealing with employment contracts.
Wow, employment contracts definitely a whole other ballgame.
Okay.
It makes you realize, though, like how often people probably encounter this duty of good faith thing in their everyday lives without even knowing it.
Oh, for sure. It's not always about, like, lawsuits and judges in robes, right?
Yeah.
It's about approaching any agreement, big or small, with a sense of honesty and fairness.
So even something as simple as like splitting a pizza with friends, it still applies.
Absolutely. It's about the principle, right? I actually saw this happen once. A group of friends, they ordered a big pizza, agreed to split the cost evenly, no problem. Then one friend insists they'll only pay for the slices they ate. Didn't like the toppings on the other half, so.
Oh, come on. Trying to renegotiate after the pizza's gone. That's just bad pizza etiquette.
Exactly. And it just highlighted for me how this duty of good faith, it goes beyond just the legal stuff. It's a mindset,
Yeah.
being fair and upfront in all your dealings, even if it's just about pepperoni and mushrooms.
Love it. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the wild world of duty of good faith,
hmm
what's like one big takeaway for our listeners, something to keep in mind as they navigate their own agreements out there in the real world?
Here's a good question to ask yourself. Am I honoring not just the letter of this agreement, the actual words, but also the spirit of it? It's not just about what you can technically get away with. It's about doing what's right, even when nobody's watching. That's what duty of good faith really boils down to.
Perfectly said. It's about building trust, making sure everyone feels like they're getting a fair shake. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
My pleasure. Always happy to geek out about contracts.
And to our listeners, remember, keep those contracts clear, your intentions honest, and maybe, just maybe, think twice before agreeing to split a pizza with that friend again. Until next time, keep diving.